Eleanor Hale rolled the last bead of her father's broken counting frame between finger and thumb, and told herself, as she told herself most nights, that a person did not need 9 beads to make a sum come right, only one good one, and the will to keep counting. The house smelled of tallow and boiled mutton, and the particular sourness of paper that had been damp once and never properly dried. And the fire in Mrs. Prentice's good parlour had burned down to the kind of warmth that was really only the memory of warmth. 2 years had passed since they had buried Thomas Hale with his name unspoken over the grave, because the rector would not say the word thief across a hired plot, and in those 2 years Eleanor had learned to keep a household's accounts to the farthing, to curtsy to women half her sense and twice her fortune, and to carry her father's one surviving counting bead in the pocket of whichever dress she owned that still had a pocket worth trusting. "You'll wear a hole clean through that bead before you wear one through your gloves," said Bessie Wren, setting down the mending and nodding at Eleanor's moving thumb. "And then what will you have to fret with?" Eleanor said that she supposed she would find something. She always did. Mrs. Prentice's household ran on a widow's jointure that was smaller than her opinions and larger than her patience, and it fell to Eleanor, as companion, poor relation, and unpaid clerk in a wardrobe of altered mourning, to make the smaller number behave like the larger one twice a quarter. She was good at it. She had been raised on it, at her father's elbow, in the estate office at Mericombe, learning that a ledger was a kind of conscience that could be read by anyone patient enough to ask it the right question, and she had believed then, the way children believe weather is permanent, that her father's honesty was a fact of the world, like the turning of the seasons. She no longer believed anything was permanent. She believed in candle stubs, and in her brother Tom's wages arriving whole from his apprenticeship, and in the particular cold arithmetic of what 15 shillings would and would not buy. It was the smell of the assembly rooms that struck her first that evening, wax and orange water, and too many bodies in too little air, when Mrs. Prentice insisted she come along to keep the card tallies straight, since the last companion who had tried it had charged 3 ladies for tricks they had not taken, and caused a scene that was still, 8 months on, spoken of with relish. Eleanor sat at the scoring table with a stub of pencil, and watched the room the way her father had taught her to watch a column of figures, waiting for the one entry that did not belong. She did not have to wait long. The Duke of Merrow arrived the way weather arrives, felt in a room before it is seen, and behind him came his cousin Mr. Gerald Ashworth, steering a 4th eligible young lady toward him with the patient professional cheer of a man selling a horse he did not himself believe in. Julian Ashworth was tall and tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour, and when the 4th young lady's mother began, for the 3rd time that Eleanor had counted, the sentence that started with how fortunate it was that his Grace found himself unmarried this particular season, he set down his glass on the tray of a passing footman with a decision in the gesture that turned 3 heads before he had said a word. "I need a wife," he said, not loudly, but into a room that had gone quiet enough to carry it to every corner. "Before the season opens, I do not much care who. I do care that it happen quickly, and I would be obliged if the next 3 mothers in this room would settle the matter among themselves before supper, so the rest of us may eat in peace." Someone laughed, a short unhappy bark of a laugh, and someone else's fan went suddenly still. Gerald Ashworth's smile did not move for a full 2 seconds, arriving at last a half-step ahead of his eyes, the way a servant announces a guest who has not yet come through the door. And he took his cousin's elbow and steered him off toward the card-room with a murmur Eleanor could not hear. She went back to her tallies because that was what she was there for, and it was only when the fourth young lady's brother disputed a trick and 3 tables erupted into competing arithmetic that she found herself, without quite deciding to, correcting all 3 sums aloud in the time it took the other players to find their pencils. A silence followed that was different from the first one. She looked up to find the Duke of Merrow watching her from the doorway of the card-room, with an expression she did not have a word for yet, and Gerald Ashworth watching her with an expression she recognised at once, because she had seen it on men who did sums for a living and did not like being watched doing them. "Whose girl is that?" she heard the Duke ask, and did not hear the answer. Because Mrs. Prentice had already seized her wrist to say they were leaving. "We are leaving now, Eleanor," and she went, though she carried the look on both men's faces home with her more carefully than she carried the pencil. Bessie was waiting up, because Bessie always waited up, with the fire built back to something worth calling warmth and a question already loaded behind her teeth. "Well," Bessie said, "and did his Grace of Merrow find himself a wife before supper, then same as he ordered?" Eleanor said she rather thought not. "Pity," said Bessie. "I'd have liked to see the sort of woman a man can summon like a coach and 4. Strong stomach on her, I'd think, and a very short memory." Eleanor laughed despite herself, the first real laugh in some weeks, and went up to bed with her father's bead still warm from her own pocket, and did not think again about the Duke of Merrow's tired eyes or his cousin's servant announced smile, until 3 days later, when a letter arrived at Mrs. Prentice's door, bearing a seal Eleanor did not recognise, and a hand she did not know, requesting the pleasure of Miss Hale's attendance at Merrow Come, on the recommendation of persons who had observed her particular quickness with figures, to discuss a position suited to those talents. Mrs. Prentice read it twice, and looked at Eleanor with the closest thing to respect she had ever managed. Bessie read it once, upside down over Eleanor's shoulder, and said only that it was a long way to go to be looked at like a horse, and that she supposed she had best pack the good bonnet. They rode 2 hours by hired chaise through country gone brown and thirsty, with a summer that had not broken into a single decent rain, dust rising off the lane in a fine pale film that settled on Eleanor's black skirts until she gave up brushing it away, and it was the smell that told her they had arrived before the house itself came into view around the last bend, wood smoke and beeswax, and underneath both the warm animal smell of a working stable that no amount of grandeur ever quite managed to disguise. Merrowcombe stood the colour of old honey in the afternoon light, and above its stable roof a weather vane in the shape of a running hare turned, slow and certain, though there was barely wind enough to lift it. A small girl was waiting on the steps in a pinafore that had clearly been clean an hour before, and she looked at Eleanor with the frank, assessing stare of a child who has been told nothing and intends to find everything out for herself. "Are you the sums person?" the girl said. "I am Georgiana. I am 9. I am dreadful at fractions, and everyone pretends this does not matter, which it does, because cook cannot halve a recipe, and we are forever running short of pudding." Eleanor said that fractions were, in her experience, mostly a matter of temper rather than talent, and that she had never yet met a child who could not be bribed into liking them with the promise of pudding at the end of the lesson. Georgiana decided, on the spot and audibly, that she approved. It was the Dowager Duchess who received her properly, in a morning room too warm for the season and too full of the particular clutter of a woman who had outlived most of the people she had collected things to please, and she looked at Eleanor over the top of a pair of spectacles she plainly did not need for looking, only for the effect of looking over them. "Thomas Hale's daughter," the Dowager said, before Eleanor had given her name, and let the silence after it do the work of a question. "I did wonder if you would come, or send regrets and spare us both the awkwardness. You have his chin. I remember him presenting the harvest accounts every Michaelmas with that same chin set exactly so, as if daring the numbers to disagree with him. Eleanor said that she had come because a position had been offered, and her circumstances did not permit her the luxury of declining positions on the grounds of awkwardness. "No," said the dowager, "I don't imagine they do." She did not say what she had heard of Thomas Hale's disgrace, and Eleanor did not ask, and the two facts sat between them for the rest of the interview like a third person neither would introduce. It was in the passage afterward, on her way out to find where the housekeeper had put her box, that she came upon the Duke himself, coat off, sleeves pushed back, going over a stack of papers at a small writing table shoved into an alcove, clearly never meant for work. And she noted, before she could stop herself noting it, the old ink stain worked into the side of his third finger, the kind that came only from years of a man doing his own correspondence rather than dictating it to a secretary. He looked up, and for a moment neither of them managed the ordinary business of greeting. "Miss Hale," he said at last, "my grandmother tells me you correct card tallies the way other people breathe." Eleanor said that she had been taught young, and by a careful teacher, and watched something move behind his face at the word teacher that she could not read and did not, that first day, try very hard to. He asked whether she had been told what the position entailed, and she said sums and Georgiana's fractions and the general steadying of a household, and he said, after a pause a half-second too long to be nothing, that this was more or less true, and rubbed his thumb once across the old ink stain on his finger, and did not explain the pause, and she did not ask him to. She did not yet know enough to know that his grandmother had already begun, quietly and without consulting him, to consider whether the steward's disgraced daughter might make a Duke of Merrow a very particular kind of wife. The dinner that undid the last of Eleanor's illusions about the simplicity of her new position was held 11 days later, and it was the sort of dinner a great house gives when it wants the county to see that its business is entirely ordinary, which is generally the surest sign that it is not. Gerald Ashworth sat at his cousin's right hand as he had. Eleanor, gathered from the servants' unguarded talk, sat at every such dinner for 15 years, ever since the old Duke's death had left the estate's finances in the hands of a boy of 14, and a trust that needed a steady man to run it until he came of age. And Gerald Ashworth had simply never stopped being steady, or never stopped being needed, depending which servant you asked, and how much ale had gone into the asking. Miss Camilla Draycott sat across from Julian in a gown the colour of new cream, and she was, Eleanor thought, watching her laugh at something the dowager said, entirely likeable, which made the whole arrangement worse rather than better, because it is a much smaller cruelty to dislike the woman you are meant to make way for. It was over the second course that the dowager, with the particular relish of the very old for saying aloud what everyone else has agreed to whisper, informed the table at large that his Grace had, until his 30th birthday, which fell that Michaelmas, and not a day later, to be lawfully married, or the whole of the Merrow Trust, its rents, its capital. And the guardianship of Miss Georgiana, besides, would pass under the terms of the late Duke's will into Mr. Ashworth's hands for a further 20 years. Whatever his Grace's own wishes on the matter might by then have become. A tidy piece of drafting, Gerald said into the small silence that followed, setting down his fork with the unhurried courtesy of a man who has had years to grow comfortable inside an arrangement other people are only now hearing named aloud. My uncle never trusted a young man's judgment until it had survived a wedding. I confess I have come rather to agree with him. Julian said nothing, and cut his meat with a precision that told Eleanor, 3 seats down, that he was cutting rather than eating, and it was Camilla Draycott, of all people, who broke the silence with a light, kind, entirely deliberate laugh, and a remark about the difficulty of finding a bride on any timetable a solicitor would recognise, which let the table breathe again, and the footman move on to the next course. Eleanor found Bessie afterward in the servants' passage, both of them out of place and glad of each other's company for it, and it was there, in the smell of gravy and beeswax and somebody's pipe smoke drifting from the yard, that Eleanor said aloud, for the first time in 2 years, the thing she had never once said to Mrs. Prentice, or to Tom, or to the rector, who had buried her father. They took everything from him before they took his name, she said. The house, then the position, then the friends, and only after all of that the name, as if the name were the smallest part, and they were doing him a courtesy waiting so long to touch it. I used to think if I ever heard the word trust said in that particular tone again I should be able to bear it. I find I cannot. Bessie did not offer comfort, because Bessie never offered comfort where a fact would serve better. Your father used to say, Bessie said, that a column which won't balance isn't lying to you. It's only waiting to be asked the right question. Eleanor said she remembered him saying it, over the harvest books, every year, like a grace before meat. She did not say what she was beginning, without yet admitting it to herself, to wonder, which was whether anyone in this house had ever asked Gerald Ashworth's columns the right question in 15 years, or whether they had simply been grateful, the way frightened, grieving people are grateful, that someone steady had offered to hold the numbers so they did not have to look at them. It was Julian who found her 3 evenings later in the estate's schoolroom, correcting Georgiana's fraction sums by the last of the daylight, and he stood in the doorway for a moment before she noticed him, watching with an expression she would later learn to call, privately, his ledger face, the one he wore when he was adding something up, and did not yet like the total. I am told, he said, that you once kept your father's harvest accounts from the age of 12, and that you kept them better than the clerk he paid to do it. Eleanor said that was an exaggeration invented by a nurse who loved her more than she deserved. I have also been told, he said, that you turned down a place in a milliner's shop, a very respectable milliner's shop, my grandmother assures me, to keep an old woman's household books instead, for wages that would insult a scullery maid. Eleanor said that milliners did not, as a rule, need help with fractions, and that she had found she preferred numbers to ribbon, which was true, and which he seemed, for a reason she did not yet understand, to find enormously reassuring. He asked her to walk with him, and she went, because refusing a duke in his own schoolroom was not a position her circumstances afforded her either, and they walked the length of the long gallery, while Georgiana's governess put the child to bed somewhere above them, and he told her plainly, without the ornament she had expected a man of his rank to reach for, what she had already half assembled from dinner-table silences, that he needed a wife by Michaelmas, that Miss Draycott, whatever the county believed, wanted no more of him than friendship, and had said so to his face with a relief on both their parts that had rather settled the matter, and that he found himself, with 11 weeks remaining, and no candidate whose company did not make him tired, before the soup was cleared, considering an arrangement rather than a courtship. I am not asking you to love me, he said, stopping at the gallery's far window, where the hair weather vanes stood black against a sky, gone the flat gold of a drought sunset. I am asking whether you would consider marrying a stranger, for the settlement of a debt you did not incur, in exchange for a security neither your circumstances nor mine will otherwise permit either of us. I would provide for your brother. I would clear your household of want for the whole of your life, whatever became of mine. I ask nothing further of you than the appearance of a marriage, kept with civility, until such time as either of us wished otherwise. Eleanor listened to the whole of it without once looking away from him, which she had learned in 2 years of genteel dependence was the single power a poor woman retained in a room like this, and when he had finished, she said the things she had been turning over since the harvest book conversation with Bessie, since her father's grace before meat, since the moment Gerald Ashworth's smile had arrived a half-step ahead of his eyes across a card-room 3 weeks before. "I will marry you," she said, "on one condition, and I will not soften it to make it easier for you to grant. Every day of our marriage, for as long as it lasts, you will answer one question of mine, whatever it touches, with complete honesty, and you will not deflect it. And you will not answer it kindly instead of truly. One honest answer a day. That is my price." He looked at her for a long moment, and something that was almost a laugh moved through his face and did not quite arrive at his mouth. "That," he said, "may prove the most expensive bargain I have ever struck." "Good," said Eleanor. "Then you'll take it seriously." He held out his hand, not to shake, but simply to hold. The old ink stained dark against his knuckle in the last of the light, and it was in that stillness, before either of them had said another word, that Gerald Ashworth's voice reached them from the far end of the gallery, pleasant and unhurried, and entirely too well timed, asking whether his Grace had yet settled the matter of the tenant repairs at Hobbs Croft, because the quarters accounts would want closing by week's end, and there really was no sense in leaving figures to go stale. They were married 8 days later, by special licence, in the small chapel at Mericombe, with Bessie standing witness on Eleanor's side, because there was no one else left to stand there, and the dowager watching from the front pew with an expression Eleanor could not read, and did not, in the flurry of it, have leisure to try. It was not the wedding she had imagined at 19, before her father's ruin had taught her to stop imagining weddings at all, and she found she did not mind that as much as she had expected to. Georgiana cried with the frank, unembarrassed enthusiasm of a child who has decided a thing is romantic and means to enjoy every second of believing it. And afterward, in the quiet of the estate office that had once, Eleanor learned only later, and by accident been her own father's, Julian gave her his first honest answer under their bargain, unprompted, before she had even thought to ask. "I did not offer for you because you were convenient," he said. "I offered because you corrected 3 men's arithmetic in the time it took them to find their pencils, and I have not been able to stop thinking of it since, which is a foolish reason to marry a stranger, and the only true one I have." Eleanor said that was, as opening honesty went, a promising start, and did not tell him that she had thought of little else herself since that same evening, because the bargain, after all, was his to keep, not hers to match, not yet. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm she had not expected marriage, even this kind of marriage, to have. On the 4th day she asked him whether he had truly meant what he said at the assembly about not caring whom he married, and he admitted, wincing, that he had said it out of exhaustion and had regretted it within the hour, watching 3 mothers take it as a starting gun. On the 9th day she asked him whether he had ever liked his cousin, and he was a long time answering, long enough that she nearly withdrew the question, before he said that he had loved Gerald once, as a boy loves an uncle who teaches him to fish, and that he no longer knew how much of that love had been earned, and how much simply owed to habit and gratitude for a debt he could not itemize. On the 14th day, to break a run of questions that had grown too heavy for both of them, she asked whether he actually enjoyed the cook's pheasant in cream sauce, which the whole household praised as his particular favourite, and watched him wrestle for a visibly painful 10 seconds between honesty and 30 years of good manners before he confessed, in the tone of a man admitting to treason, that he had always found it faintly nauseating and had eaten it twice a week since boyhood rather than wound a cook he was fond of. Bessie, informed of this exchange over the mending that evening, said it was the single most useful piece of information anyone had extracted from a duke in the history of England, and that Eleanor should have it carved on something. It was on the 17th day, going over the household books with Georgiana at her side, ostensibly to teach the child fractions by way of the quarterly linen accounts, that Eleanor found the number that did not sit easily. The repairs invoice for a tenancy called Hobbs Croft, £40 for roof timber and thatching, appeared for the 3rd year running in the estate ledger, and yet when she asked Georgiana, idly, where Hobbs Croft lay, the child said there was no such farm on the whole estate, and never had been in her memory, and old Hobbs, who had once kept it, had died before Georgiana was born, and his cottage had stood empty and roofless for a decade. Eleanor said nothing to Georgiana beyond a mild observation that estates kept strange old names sometimes, and closed the ledger, and did not open it again that day, but that night she took her father's bead from her pocket, and turned it slowly between her fingers for a long while before she slept. Thinking of a grace, said every harvest over a column, that would not lie so much as wait. The dowager found her the next morning in the long gallery, standing rather too still before the hair weathervane, which had not turned once in 3 days for want of wind, and said, without preamble, in the manner of a woman who has decided a thing needs saying, and does not intend to waste breath easing into it, that a thing which is only lost asks nothing further of you, but a thing which is only buried will go on waiting, quite patiently, for as long as it takes someone to come and dig. Eleanor asked her what, precisely, she believed was buried. The dowager did not answer that question, only looked at her for a long moment with an expression far less hostile than the one she had worn at their first interview, and said instead that Thomas Hale had been the only man in her long acquaintance who had ever made her harvest accounts entertaining to read, and that she had never, not once in 15 years, quite managed to convince herself that a man who found sums entertaining was the sort of man who stole from them. The counting-house stood apart from the main block of Merrowcombe, across a yard that smelled at all hours of hay and horse, and the cold iron of the smithy beyond, and it kept its own single-lit window burning long after the rest of the house had gone dark, because Gerald Ashworth, everyone agreed, worked harder than any man his age had any obligation to. Eleanor watched that window from her own for 3 nights running before she found the nerve to cross the yard herself, on the 4th night, when she knew for a fact that Gerald had ridden to the county town on trust business, and would not return before morning. The door was not locked, because a man confident enough had no reason to lock a door against a household that trusted him, and the stillness that always cost her something to hold settled over her the moment she crossed the threshold. The ledgers ranged in their calf bindings exactly as her father's had once been ranged. The smell of ink and dust and beeswax candles burned down to their last inch. She found the Hobbs Croft entries going back 11 years, £40 a year, repairs never inspected, never questioned, entered in a hand too careful to be careless, and too regular to be honest, and beside them, in a separate drawer she had to force with a paper knife, she was fairly certain she would be hanged for if caught. a second small book that did not match the first, recording sums that were smaller, cleverer, spread across a dozen fictitious tenancies instead of one. The kind of theft that survives 15 years precisely because no single figure in it is ever quite large enough to catch a busy man's eye. She copied 3 entries into the lining of her glove with a stub of pencil, her hands steadier than her breathing, and left the way she had come. And it was only crossing the yard again, the hair weather vane a black shape against a moon gone thin and hard with the drought, that she allowed herself to feel the fear she had been too occupied to feel inside. She went to Gerald himself 2 days later, not to accuse but to ask, because her father had taught her that the guilty flinch from questions, and the merely careless simply answer them, and she wanted to see which Gerald Ashworth was, before she trusted her own eyes over her own hope. He received her in the counting-house with perfect civility, poured her tea himself, and when she raised Hobbs Croft, mild as a woman asking after a neighbour's health, he did not flinch at all. "You have your father's habit of noticing," he said, and his smile arrived a half-step ahead of his eyes, the way a servant announces a guest who has not yet come through the door. He noticed a great deal, in his time, and it did him no good in the end, because noticing is not the same as understanding a household's true costs, my dear. I held this estate together with my own hands through a boy's minority and a war of prices that would have ruined a lesser trust, and I do not apologise for the small liberties a man in my position must occasionally take to keep the whole standing upright, when the family itself was too grieved and too young to notice or to thank me for it. He said it so reasonably, so entirely without heat, that for a moment Eleanor almost believed she had misjudged the whole matter, and it was only afterward, walking back across the yard with the cold arithmetic of 11 years and £40 turning over in her mind, that she understood he had, in the space of one civil sentence, confessed to exactly as much as he judged she could already prove, and not 1 farthing more. She went that same afternoon to the old rector, a friend of her father's from before the ruin, a man who had christened her and had wept, she had been told, more openly at Thomas Hale's funeral than the family had thought proper, and she asked him, plainly, whether her father had ever left anything with him. The rector was a long time answering, and when he did his voice had the particular unsteadiness of a man releasing a weight he had carried far longer than he had ever expected to carry it. "He left me a packet," the rector said, the winter before he died, and told me to give it to no one, not even to you, unless you came asking the right question yourself, of your own understanding. And not because anyone else had sent you. I have kept it 11 years, wondering whether that day would come before I did. The packet was heavier than its size suggested, wrapped in oiled cloth against the damp, and sealed with her father's own signet, and Eleanor did not open it in the rector's study, because some things, she found, could not be read in front of even the kindest witness. She carried it back to Mericombe, pressed against her under her cloak, like something that might be taken from her if anyone saw it too soon, and she found Julian in the estate office, going over the quarter's figures with the particular set jaw he wore now, whenever a column touched anything Gerald had signed. And she set the packet on the desk between them without a word. Inside was her father's own private ledger, kept in a hand so familiar it undid her composure for a full minute before she could read past the first page, recording, year on year, the true costs of every tenancy he had managed against the figures he had been instructed. With increasing insistence, and finally outright threat, to enter in the estate's public book instead. There was a letter beneath it, written in the last winter of his life, explaining, in the plain, unornamented language of a man who had given up expecting to be believed while living, and had decided to leave the believing to whoever came after him, that he had discovered the false entries 3 years before his dismissal, had raised them privately with the young trustee, then managing the estate on the boy Duke's behalf, and had been told, with perfect courtesy, that a steward's suspicions against a gentleman's honour were a serious thing to raise without absolute proof, and that it would go very much better for everyone, including Thomas Hale's own family, if he set the matter down and attended instead to his proper duties. He had not set it down. Within the year the forged entries had begun appearing in a hand disturbingly close to his own, entries he had never made, sums he had never touched, and by the time he understood what was being built around him, it was already finished, and no one, not the old Duke's solicitors, not the county, not even, in the end, his own wife, had believed a dismissed steward's word against a trusted cousin's ledgers. "A column that will not balance is not lying to you," Eleanor read aloud, her father's own hand steady on the page, though hers was not steady holding it. "It is only waiting to be asked the right question, and I have asked it now for the last time I expect to be permitted. And I set this down not for justice, which I no longer look to see, but so that my daughter, whenever she is grown enough to need it, will know that her father was a careful man who loved his numbers and never once made them lie." Julian did not speak for a long moment after she finished, and when he did his voice had none of its usual composure left in it. "I was 14 when they told him to set it down," he said. "I signed nothing. I understood nothing. I have spent 15 years grateful to a man who let my own father's steward die, owing his good name to a debt he never incurred, and I did not once ask the question your father asked, because I never once had to be brave to keep my comfort. It was in that silence, raw and unfinished between them, that the door opened without a knock, and Gerald Ashworth stood in it with his hat still in his hand, as though he had ridden hard and arrived expecting only ordinary business, his eyes moving once, quickly, to the packet open on the desk, and then to Eleanor's face, and then, longest of all, to his cousin's. "I see," he said, and his voice had lost, for the first time in Eleanor's hearing, every trace of its unhurried warmth, that Thomas Hale's daughter has been digging in ground I had rather hoped time would settle undisturbed. He did not raise his voice. He set his hat down with great care on the edge of the desk, as a man sets down something he intends to be able to pick up again quickly, and he said, in a tone gentler than any threat Eleanor had ever heard delivered, that it would be a very great pity, with barely 6 weeks left before Michaelmas, and a trust still to be legally settled, for word to reach the county's solicitors that the new Duchess of Merrow was the daughter of a proven thief attempting, in her own turn, to forge a case against an innocent man, and that her young brother's apprenticeship, he understood, was held at the pleasure of a master who valued the good opinion of this family rather more than he valued a 15-year-old boy's continued usefulness. Then he took up his hat again, bowed with perfect correctness to them both, and left the room without once raising his voice above the tone a man might use to discuss the weather. The Dowager, when the matter reached her the following morning, as such matters always reached the Dowager eventually, sat very still in her overheated morning-room and said, at last, that there might yet be a quiet way through it. Money could be found, she said, to settle whatever debts had made Gerald desperate enough to begin, and a word could be had with the county solicitors to see the trust pass cleanly at Michaelmas regardless, and Thomas Hale's name, though it grieved her to say it, was 2 years buried, and past the reach of any comfort a public reckoning could offer him now. Whereas Eleanor's own name, and her brother's livelihood, and Julian's whole difficult inheritance, were very much still within reach of a scandal's damage. "You would ask me to let him rest a thief," Eleanor said, "so that the living might rest comfortable." The dowager said that comfort was not nothing. To a woman who had buried a husband and both her sons, and learned exactly how little truth-telling had ever restored to her, Eleanor said, and it cost her something to keep her voice as level as she made it, that she had spent 2 years watching her father's name do without comfort, so that other people's could keep theirs, and that she would not spend the rest of her life doing the same on his behalf while calling it wisdom. It was Julian who found her afterward in the long gallery, the hair weather-veined still and black against a sky gathering. For the first time in weeks, towards something that might at last be rain, and he told her, in the careful, deliberate tone of a man delivering news he has convinced himself is kindness, that he had been thinking, that Gerald's threat against Tom's position was not idle, that scandal broken now, 6 weeks before the trust must legally settle, might cost them everything even if the truth in it were entirely on their side, and that perhaps, until the trust was secured and the danger past, she and her brother ought to remove quietly to her aunt's house, away from the worst of whatever Gerald meant to do. "You are asking me to leave," Eleanor said. "I am asking you to be safe," he said, "which is not the same thing, whatever it looks like from where you are standing." "It is exactly the same thing," she said, "from where I am standing, because I have been sent away for my own good once before in my life, by men who called it kindness, and meant only that my presence was inconvenient to their comfort, and I told myself I would never again mistake the one for the other, and yet here you are, offering me the identical bargain in a kinder voice." She did not wait for him to answer that, because she was no longer certain, in that moment, that she trusted herself to hear the answer rightly, and she went that same evening, with Bessie in the packet and her father's bead and very little else, back to the rector's small house in the village, and told herself, lying awake to the first real rain in 8 weeks, drumming on a strange roof, that she had left to protect Tom and not because a duke's careful kindness had sounded, for one unbearable moment, exactly like a door closing. She did not know, could not have known, that Julian had walked the long gallery alone, for the better part of that night, rubbing his thumb raw over the old ink stain on his finger, cursing himself in language his grandmother would not have believed him capable of, for having offered comfort in the one voice guaranteed to sound. To a woman who had heard it once already, from people who did not love her, exactly like rejection. It was Camilla Draycott, of all people, who brought the matter to its head, arriving at Merrowcombe 3 days later with her brother Henry in tow, and a look on her face that suggested she had run out of patience with everyone's careful silences at once. Henry Draycott was a solicitor, precise and soft-spoken, and he had, it emerged, reviewed the Merrow Trust accounts himself some 9 years before, at Gerald's own invitation, and had flagged 3 irregularities in a private letter that had been met with a generous retainer, a warm word about his prospects in the county, and a suggestion that a young solicitor's career was better served by discretion than by diligence. He had taken the retainer. He had kept the letter. He had spent 9 years, he admitted, in a shame he had never named aloud even to his sister, and he had brought the letter with him now because Camilla had told him, in terms he described as considerably less gentle than her usual manner, that a coward's shame kept secret helped no one, and that it was past time he chose which kind of man he meant to be for the rest of his life. It was the dowager, in the end, who called the household together, all of it, solicitors summoned from the county town under the plain pretext of settling the trust's Michaelmas papers, Gerald invited as a matter of course, because to exclude him would itself have been an accusation, and Eleanor sent for by a note in the dowager's own hand that said only, "Come and bring your father's book." The ground has waited long enough to be dug. The library at Mericombe held more people than Eleanor had ever seen in it, solicitors at the long table with their spectacles and their careful neutral faces, the dowager enthroned by the cold hearth, Camilla and her brother standing together near the window, Julian at the table's head with an expression Eleanor could not read across the room's whole width, and Gerald seated, composed, a cup of tea at his elbow, watching her enter with a smile that arrived, as it always arrived, a half step ahead of his eyes. It was Henry Draycott who spoke first, laying his own 9-year-old letter on the table and reading it aloud in a voice that shook only slightly, so that everyone in the room heard the same words at the same moment. And then it was Eleanor who set her father's ledger beside it, and read, in a voice she was proud, afterward, to remember as steady, the entry for Hobbs Croft 11 years, running against a tenancy that did not exist, and the letter her father had written in the last winter of his life, to a daughter he had trusted to ask the right question eventually. Gerald listened to the whole of it with his hands folded and his face composed, and it was only when one of the solicitors reached to draw the false public ledger from its place at the table's far end, to lay it beside the true one for comparison, that something in him broke its long, careful stillness, and he came half out of his chair and lunged for the book with a speed that had nothing civil. Left in it at all, his hand closing on the cover a full second before anyone else in the room had even understood he meant to move. The solicitor did not let go. In the small, undignified tug that followed, 3 separate people saw exactly what they needed to see, and Gerald, realizing it, let his hand fall and sat back down with the particular stillness of a man who understands the argument is already lost and is only now deciding how he means to lose it. "I am not cruel," he said at last, into a silence no one else seemed inclined to break. "I am arithmetical, which the young always mistake for cruelty. My own son's debts would have ruined this family's name a decade before this one ever needed rescuing, and I paid them, year on year, out of sums no one troubled to count closely enough to miss, and I never once believed I was owed forgiveness for it, only that I was owed the courtesy of not being asked to explain it aloud." For one unguarded moment his composure slipped entirely, and what was underneath it was not menace at all, but something closer to grief. An old man's tired face for the length of a single breath before the mask found its way back. He rose, gathered what dignity remained to him, and asked only, with something that might almost have been a genuine bow, whether he might be permitted to leave the county quietly rather than be marched from it, and the dowager, after a long look at her grandson, said that he might, and that it was the last courtesy this family owed him. He left without another word, and the room began, slowly, to empty around the 2 people it had actually been about all along. Julian found her by the cold hearth after the last solicitor had gone, and he did not begin with an apology, because he had learned, in the space of 1 bad week, exactly how little that word was worth against the thing it was meant to cover. "I told myself I was protecting you," he said. "I have had 2 days to understand that I was protecting myself from watching you be hurt," which is not the same virtue at all. However, I dressed it up at the time, and I am sorry for the voice I used, because it was the voice of every man who ever told your father to set his own truth aside for someone else's comfort. And I will spend a good deal longer than this evening, making certain you never hear it from me again. Eleanor said that she had not left because she doubted his heart. only because she had heard in his kindness an echo of every kindness that had ever asked her to make herself smaller and call it wisdom, and that she needed him to understand the difference between the two, so that neither of them mistook it again. "Then let me answer today's question before you ask it," he said, "since I find I no longer want to wait to be asked. I did not need a wife before the season opened. I told a room full of strangers that I did, because it was easier to say than the truth, which is that I needed, very badly, someone who would ask me hard questions and expect true answers, and I did not know that was what I needed until you began asking them." Eleanor allowed herself, at last, to smile properly, and said that as declarations went it would do, though she intended to hold him to a good many more honest answers before she considered the debt paid in full. And then she named her terms, because her father had taught her that a bargain worth keeping was a bargain spoken plainly, and not softened for the comfort of the person granting it. She wanted her father's name entered, formally and publicly, into the estate's own record, cleared of every charge that had ever been laid against it. She wanted the tenants Gerald had quietly shorted for 11 years repaid, to the farthing, out of the trust's own funds, and not out of shame's hurry to be done with the matter. She wanted the keeping of Merricombe's true books to remain, for as long as she lived there, her own work and no one else's, not as a courtesy extended to a duchess, but as a right earned by a woman who had proved, twice now, that she could be trusted with a column no one else had dared to balance. And she wanted her brother Tom brought into the estate's own service, properly apprenticed under a master who would answer to the family directly, so that no man's private grudge could ever again hold a Hale's livelihood hostage to his silence. Julian agreed to every term before she had finished naming the last of them, and it was the dowager, listening from the doorway longer than either of them had realized, who said, into the small silence that followed, that she had been wrong about a great many things in her long life, and intended to say so publicly at least once before she died, and that this seemed as fitting an occasion as any she was likely to get. They were married a second time, properly, before the whole parish, on a morning in early October when the first hard frost of the year had silvered the grass, and the hair weather vane stood catching the low gold light, with a stillness that finally meant peace rather than absence of wind. A year had turned since the special licence, and the small chapel, and Bessie standing witness alone, and this time the church was full, tenants whose repairs had at last been honestly paid standing beside solicitors who had once looked away, Camilla Draycott seated near the front, with a lieutenant recently returned from sea, gripping her hand with the particular tightness of a man who had almost lost his chance to hold it at all, and Henry Draycott standing a little apart from them both, with the unburdened look of a man who had finally set a 9-year wait down. Georgiana, grown an inch and insufferably proud of it, carried a small basket of late roses and informed everyone within earshot that she had personally overseen the pudding, which this time had halved correctly. Eleanor wore no black. It was the first time in 3 years she had worn no black, and the plain cream of her gown felt, against her skin, like a sentence finally allowed to finish itself. Afterward, at the wedding breakfast laid out under the last of the drought-browned lime trees, Bessie surveyed the whole glittering business with her arms folded, and pronounced it, at last, an improvement on the first attempt, though she added that she still did not think much of a bridegroom who needed a full year and a public reckoning to work out what he wanted, when any sensible woman could have told him inside a fortnight. The dowager, seated in the place of honour with a shawl she did not need, and a glass she fully intended to finish, rose unsteadily to speak, and said, in the voice of a woman who had decided plainness was the last luxury age had left her, that she had once believed a name was a thing a family owned and a house merely wore, and that she had lived long enough now to learn the truth was the other way about, that a name was owned only by the person who had earned it honestly, and that Thomas Hale had earned his a great deal more thoroughly than most men who had ever sat at her table, herself, in her youth, included. She asked the assembled parish to drink to his memory before they drank to the bride, and the parish did, and Eleanor found she could hear her father's name spoken aloud in that particular company. At last, without the old flinch she had carried for 2 years like a stone in her shoe. That evening, in the estate office that had once been Thomas Hale's and was now unmistakably her own, Eleanor found Georgiana bent over a battered wooden counting frame that Julian had commissioned from the village carpenter as a wedding gift. Every bead sanded smooth and new, but one, set exactly at the frame's centre. Worn dull and round by 20 years of a dead man's careful thumb. Georgiana looked up and asked, with the frank seriousness she brought to everything that mattered to her, whether it was true that this particular bead had belonged to the cleverest man who had ever kept these books, and Eleanor said that it was true, and sat down beside her, and set her own hand briefly over the child's, while Georgiana worked the frame's answer out for herself, one careful column at a time. Julian found them there a little later, leaning in the doorway, with the ink stain still faint on his finger, and when Eleanor reached up without looking and pressed her thumb once, lightly, against that old familiar mark, he did not ask what she meant by it, and she did not explain, because some things, she had learned, did not need to be asked to be answered. Outside, the hair on the stable roof held perfectly still in the cold, clear evening, and somewhere below the frost was already silvering the grass for the second night running, and the house, for the first time in longer than anyone in it could easily remember, was entirely, unremarkably at peace. If this house sat with you a while tonight, stay by the fire a moment longer before you go. I keep thinking about that one true bead set into a frame full of new ones, and about a girl who never stopped asking for one honest answer a day, even when it cost her everything to keep asking. If that moment held you the way it held me, tell me so in the comments, and while you're there, settle in with Dr. Channel_name and subscribe, so the next story finds you the moment it's lit. I've got the kettle on, and another tale already waiting on the hearth for whenever you're ready to come back. Until then, sleep gently, and be kind to whoever's counting on you tomorrow.